Jackson Reed's Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor of the Boston courthouse with the same precision that had marked his rise to the top of the business world. At 42, he commanded a tech empire worth billions. But today, he wasn't here as the CEO of Horizon Technologies. Today, he was simply a man ending his marriage of 8 years. His attorney, Martin Keller, walked beside him, briefcase in hand, reviewing last-minute details about the divorce proceedings. Jackson barely listened. His mind was already calculating his next moves after this final piece of unfinished business was handled. The marriage to Charlotte had been over for months, maybe years, if he was being honest with himself. They had grown apart as his company expanded globally, as his wealth multiplied, as his name began appearing on Forbes lists. Charlotte had wanted children. He had wanted an empire. In the end, the empire won. "Remember, the prenup is solid," Martin murmured as they approached the courtroom. "This should be straightforward." Jackson nodded, adjusting his custom-made suit jacket. Straightforward was good, efficient, the way he liked to handle everything. He had a board meeting in 3 days to discuss the European expansion, and this personal matter needed to be resolved quickly. The courtroom doors opened, and Jackson stepped inside with the confidence of a man accustomed to winning. His eyes immediately found Charlotte seated at the opposite table, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun. Even now, even here, she was beautiful in a way that had once taken his breath away. She wore a modest navy dress, nothing flashy. Charlotte had never cared about the trappings of wealth the way other women in his circle did. Jackson moved toward his seat, prepared to get through this with the same detached efficiency he applied to corporate acquisitions and divestitures. Then Charlotte turned slightly, and the world beneath Jackson Reed's perfectly polished shoes crumbled. 2 infant carriers sat on either side of her chair. In each was a baby, no more than 3 months old, with tufts of dark hair unmistakably like his own. Jackson froze mid-stride, his lungs refusing to function. The twins, a boy and a girl from what he could see, were quietly sleeping, unaware their existence had just detonated a bomb in their father's carefully ordered life. "Jackson?" Martin questioned beside him, noticing his sudden stillness. Charlotte's eyes met his across the room, and the pain he saw there hit him with physical force. There was no triumph in her gaze, no gotcha moment, only a profound sadness that made his chest tighten. "You didn't tell me," Jackson finally managed, his voice barely audible. "You didn't ask," Charlotte replied simply. "You never called, never answered my messages after you moved out. Your assistant blocked my number." The memory of those urgent texts from Charlotte 6 months ago flickered through Jackson's mind. He had assumed she wanted to discuss the separation, maybe try to salvage what was already beyond repair. He had instructed his assistant to filter her calls, to give him space to focus on the Berlin acquisition. The Berlin acquisition that had added another billion to Horizon's market value, while his own children had come into the world without his knowledge. "The court will come to order," announced the judge as she entered the chamber, oblivious to the earthquake taking place in Jackson Reed's reality. The proceedings began, but Jackson heard nothing, his eyes fixed on the sleeping infants. A boy and a girl, his children. The family Charlotte had wanted, the family he had been too busy building an empire to consider. "Mr. Reed?" The judge's voice cut through his thoughts. "Are you prepared to proceed with the dissolution of marriage as outlined in the petition?" Jackson stared at the judge, then back at Charlotte and the twins. Something cracked inside him, the armor of ambition and single-minded drive that had propelled him to his billions, but cost him everything that might have mattered more. "I request a continuance, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "New circumstances have come to light that require review." Martin tensed beside him. "Jackson, what are you doing?" he whispered urgently. "The prenup is ironclad. Even with the children, Charlotte can't touch the company." Jackson turned to his attorney, suddenly seeing with perfect clarity the man he had become, a man who viewed his own children as potential liabilities to be managed. The realization sickened him. "The children aren't a legal complication, Martin," Jackson said, loud enough for Charlotte to hear. "They're my son and daughter." After the judge granted a 2-week continuance, Jackson approached Charlotte as she gathered the baby's things. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched on her face, the dark circles under her eyes partially concealed with makeup. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. Charlotte carefully adjusted the blanket over their daughter. "I tried, Jackson. For months. I left messages with your assistant. I emailed. I even went to your office, but security wouldn't let me pass the lobby." She looked up at him with tired eyes. "After a while I realized you had made your choice. The company would always come first. The words struck him like physical blows because he knew they were true. He had built walls around himself to focus on his ambitions, never considering what he might be walling out. "What are their names?" Jackson asked, his voice catching. "Ethan and Abigail," Charlotte replied, a softness coming into her expression for the first time. "They're 14 weeks old." Jackson moved closer, looking down at his sleeping children. Ethan's tiny hand was curled into a fist outside his blanket. Abigail's rosebud mouth moved slightly as she dreamed whatever infants dream about. Something inside Jackson broke open, a feeling so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. "Can I—" he began, unable to finish the question. Charlotte hesitated, then nodded. "You can hold them, if you'd like. Abigail will probably sleep through it, but Ethan's a light sleeper." With trembling hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts without hesitation, Jackson carefully lifted his son from the carrier. The baby's eyes fluttered open, deep blue eyes that mirrored his own, and Jackson Reed, who had stood firm through market crashes and hostile takeovers, felt tears roll down his cheeks. "Hello, Ethan," he whispered. "I'm your dad." Charlotte watched them, her own eyes glistening. "What happens now, Jackson?" It was a question that encompassed far more than just the paused divorce proceedings. It asked about the empire he had built, about the family he hadn't known he had, about the man he might still become if it wasn't too late. "I don't know," Jackson admitted, something he rarely said in boardrooms or business negotiations. "But I want to find out. I want to know them. I want—" He trailed off, searching for words to express the seismic shift happening within him. "I want to try again, Charlotte. Not just with them, with us." Charlotte's expression was guarded, years of disappointment having built their own walls. "It's not that simple." "I know," Jackson said, carefully returning Ethan to his carrier as the baby began to fuss. "But for the first time in years, I'm absolutely certain about what matters most, and it's not waiting for me at the office." As they left the courthouse separately that day, Charlotte with the twins, Jackson with a cancelled divorce and a heart full of regret and newfound purpose, the billionaire boss who had frozen at the sight of his children made a silent promise. Whatever it took, however long it required, he would find a way to be worthy of the family he had almost thrown away. Jackson paced the length of his penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows, phone pressed to his ear. The city lights of Boston sparkled below, a view he'd once considered the perfect backdrop for empire building. Now those same lights seemed cold and distant compared to the warmth he'd felt holding his son for those brief moments. "I need to reschedule the Berlin investors," he told Diane, his chief operating officer, "and the Tokyo conference call. Move it to next week." "Jackson, we've been planning the European expansion for months," Diane replied, concern evident in her voice. "The board is expecting—" "The board can wait," Jackson interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness in his tone. "Family emergency." The words felt foreign on his tongue. Family emergency. For years, his company had been his family, his employees, his dependents, his shareholders, his responsibility. Now the true meaning of those words crashed through the carefully constructed walls of his professional life. "Is everything okay?" Diane asked, her tone softening. Jackson paused, looking at the photo he'd pulled up on his tablet. A social media post Charlotte had made 3 months ago. The twins, just days old, swaddled in matching blankets. A post he'd missed completely while negotiating acquisitions in Singapore. "No," he admitted, "but I'm trying to make it right." After ending the call, Jackson sat heavily on his leather sofa, mind racing through the past 8 years with Charlotte. They had met when his company was just beginning to take off. She'd been a graphic designer contracted for Horizon's first major product launch. Charlotte had captivated him with her creativity, her warmth, her ability to see beauty in the ordinary. She hadn't been impressed by his growing bank account or his ambitious plans, but by the passion he'd once had for innovation itself. When had that changed? When had the means become the end? The morning after the courthouse revelation, Jackson arrived at Charlotte's brownstone in Beacon Hill. He'd purchased it for her 3 years ago, insisting she should have a beautiful home, even as he spent increasingly little time there himself. Now he stood on the doorstep like a stranger, a paper bag of fresh pastries in hand, a peace offering that felt woefully inadequate. Charlotte answered the door with Abigail cradled against her shoulder, dark circles under her eyes more pronounced than yesterday. "Jackson," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "I didn't expect you." "I should have called first," he acknowledged, suddenly unsure. The confident CEO persona that served him so well in boardrooms seemed useless here. "I brought breakfast." Charlotte hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. The home he had technically owned but rarely visited was warm and lived in, nothing like his minimalist penthouse. Baby items were scattered everywhere, a swing in the corner, a playmat on the floor, tiny clothes folded on the coffee table. "Ethan just fell asleep," Charlotte whispered, nodding toward a baby monitor. "It took 3 hours of walking the floors." Jackson set the pastries on the kitchen counter. "Let me hold her while you eat something," he offered, gesturing to Abigail. Charlotte's expression was a mixture of surprise and wariness, but she carefully transferred their daughter to his arms. "Support her head," she instructed unnecessarily. Abigail was heavier than she'd seemed yesterday, more substantial in his arms. Her eyes, blue like his, blinked up at him curiously. Jackson felt that same overwhelming rush of emotion, a feeling so powerful it made his throat constrict. "I've missed so much," he said softly. Charlotte took a pastry and sank into a kitchen chair, exhaustion evident in every movement. "You made your choices, Jackson." The words stung because they were true. Even now, his phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket, the empire demanding attention from its creator. Jackson silenced it without looking, focusing instead on the tiny fingers that had wrapped around one of his. "I want to help Charlotte, not just financially. I want to be here, to be their father, to try to be the husband I promised to be." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. "Do you know how many times I've wanted to hear those words? How many nights I've lain awake waiting for you to come home, only to receive a text that you were working late? How many holidays and anniversaries you've missed because some deal couldn't wait?" Each question was a knife twisting in Jackson's chest because he remembered those texts, those missed moments, those choices that had seemed so important at the time. "I know I can't undo that," he said quietly, carefully sitting across from her with Abigail still cradled in his arms. "But I can be different moving forward." Charlotte laughed without humor. "For how long, Jackson? A week? A month? Until the next billion-dollar opportunity comes along?" She ran her hands through her hair, a gesture of frustration he remembered well. The twins need consistency. They need a father who's actually present. Before Jackson could respond, a cry came through the baby monitor. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. "Your son has your timing," she said, rising wearily. "Let me," Jackson offered, but the uncertainty in his eyes was obvious. "Have you ever changed a diaper, Jackson?" Charlotte asked, already heading toward the stairs. He hadn't, of course, and they both knew it. Another stark reminder of how unprepared he was for fatherhood, how much he had to learn. When Charlotte returned with a freshly changed and still fussing Ethan, Jackson was walking Abigail around the kitchen, awkwardly patting her back as she began to whimper. "They're hungry," Charlotte explained, taking Abigail from him and settling on the couch with practiced ease. She positioned both babies for feeding, a feat of multitasking that left Jackson in awe. "How do you do this alone?" he asked, the full weight of her daily reality finally hitting him. "I hired a night nurse for the first month," Charlotte replied. "Your money is good for something, but she left last week, and I haven't had more than 3 consecutive hours of sleep since." Jackson watched her with their children, her exhaustion evident, but her tenderness unwavering. He thought of his pristine penthouse, his private jet, his corner office with views of the harbor, all the trappings of success that suddenly seemed hollow. "Move in with me," he blurted out. "The penthouse has plenty of room." "No," Charlotte cut him off firmly. "This is their home. This is where they feel secure." "Then I'll move in here," Jackson countered, surprising himself with how easily the solution came. "I'll convert the home office into a nursery for Ethan. The guest room can be mine." Charlotte stared at him, clearly shocked by the offer. "You can't just upend your life like that. You have a company to run." "I have children to raise," Jackson replied, the words feeling right as they left his mouth. "And Diane can handle the day-to-day operations for a while." "Until when?" Charlotte challenged, shifting Abigail slightly. "Until you get bored with 3 a.m. feedings and endless diaper changes? Until you realize that building sandcastles with toddlers doesn't give you the same rush as closing a multi-million-dollar deal." Her words cut deep because the fear behind them was justified. Jackson had never shown himself to be anything but ambitious, driven by the next goal, the next acquisition, the next milestone. "I don't know how to prove to you that I've changed," he admitted, "but I know that seeing them, seeing what I nearly threw away, has changed something fundamental in me." A tense silence fell between them, broken only by the soft sounds of the twins. Finally, Charlotte spoke, her voice tired but resolute. "You can stay in the guest room for 2 weeks," she said. "No assistants, no housekeepers, no escaping to the office when things get hard. Just you, me, and 2 infants who don't care about your net worth." "Thank you," Jackson said, relief washing over him. It was a test, and they both knew it. A chance to prove that the man who had built an empire could learn to build something far more precious. "Don't thank me yet," Charlotte warned, a hint of her old humor breaking through. "You haven't experienced their synchronized midnight screaming sessions." For the first time in what felt like years, Jackson smiled a genuine smile. "I've faced hostile takeovers and market crashes. How bad can it be?" Charlotte's answering laugh told him everything he needed to know about the challenge ahead. And strangely, Jackson Reed found himself more eager for this challenge than any business venture he'd ever pursued. By the end of his first week living in the guest room, Jackson Reed had discovered humility in ways his Ivy League education and meteoric business rise had never taught him. His custom suits hung untouched in the closet, replaced by jeans and t-shirts perpetually spotted with spit-up. His precisely scheduled days had dissolved into the chaotic rhythm of infant needs. His hands, once occupied with signing contracts and shaking on deals, now changed diapers, prepared bottles, and rocked babies with increasing confidence. The twins were teaching him what truly mattered: one sleepless night, one tiny smile, one peaceful moment at a time. "You're getting pretty good at that," Charlotte commented as she entered the nursery, where Jackson was successfully changing Ethan's diaper, a task that had once seemed more daunting than negotiating with Chinese investors. Jackson secured the diaper with a triumphant smile. "I've always been a quick study." Charlotte leaned against the doorframe, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Over the past week, the ice between them had begun to thaw, giving way to a cautious warmth. They moved around each other with growing ease, partners in the overwhelming job of caring for two infants, if not yet partners in the way they once had been. "The Jackson Reed I knew would never have believed this scene," Charlotte said, a hint of wonder in her voice. "Fortune 500's most ruthless CEO singing lullabies at 3 in the morning." Jackson winced at the magazine title he'd once worn as a badge of honor. "I'm learning there are more important metrics for success." Later that evening, after the twins were asleep, momentarily at least, Jackson and Charlotte sat at the kitchen table with mugs of tea, the closest thing to a break they'd had all day. Charlotte scrolled through her phone while Jackson reviewed emails on his tablet, though with significantly less urgency than he once would have. "Your board is getting restless," Charlotte noted, holding up her phone to show a business news headline. "Horizon stock dips as Reed's extended absence raises questions." Jackson sighed, setting down his tablet. "Martin's been calling daily, so has Diane. The Berlin deal is stalling without my direct involvement." "And?" Charlotte prompted, studying him carefully. "And they'll have to wait," Jackson replied firmly. "The Berlin acquisition will still be there in a few weeks. These moments with the twins won't." Charlotte's expression softened slightly. "You surprise me, Jackson. I didn't think you could step away from Horizon, even temporarily." "Neither did I," he admitted. "But holding them that first day in the courthouse, it was like seeing in color after years of black and white." He met her gaze directly. "I built Horizon thinking it was what would define my life. I was wrong." The moment stretched between them, fragile and hopeful, until Charlotte's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's Dr. Winters," she said, referring to the twins' pediatrician. "At this hour?" Jackson felt a flicker of worry as she answered. Charlotte's expression grew serious as she listened, occasionally asking questions. When she hung up, her face was pale. "What is it?" Jackson asked, immediately alert. "Abigail's test results," Charlotte explained, her voice tight with tension. "They found some concerning markers in her blood work. Dr. Winters wants us to bring her to Children's Hospital tomorrow for more comprehensive testing." Cold fear gripped Jackson's heart. "What kind of markers? What does it mean?" "She's not sure yet. It could be nothing," Charlotte said, but the worry in her eyes betrayed her. "Or it could be a rare metabolic disorder. She mentioned something called PKU." Jackson was already pulling out his tablet, searching for information. "We'll get the best specialists, whatever she needs." "Jackson," Charlotte interrupted, placing her hand over his. "Money can't fix everything." The words hit him like a physical blow, because he knew they were true. All his billions couldn't guarantee his daughter's health. For a man accustomed to controlling outcomes through sheer force of will and financial power, the helplessness was paralyzing. The next morning, they brought Abigail to Boston Children's Hospital, leaving Ethan with the neighbor who had been helping Charlotte since the twins' birth. The pediatric specialty unit was a world away from the executive suites where Jackson typically spent his days. Here, His wealth and influence meant nothing compared to the expertise of the medical staff and the cruel randomness of genetics. As they waited for test results in a private room, the one concession to Jackson's status, Charlotte paced with Abigail in her arms, her anxiety palpable. "This is my fault," she said suddenly, her voice breaking. "What? How could this possibly be your fault?" Jackson asked, genuinely bewildered. Charlotte turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "I should have told you I was pregnant. I should have made sure you listened. Maybe if you'd been involved from the beginning. If I hadn't been so stressed trying to manage everything alone." "Stop," Jackson said firmly, crossing the room to stand before her. "None of this is your fault. If anyone should bear blame, it's me." He gently brushed a tear from her cheek. "I'm the one who pushed you away, who was too absorbed in my own ambitions to see what truly mattered." Charlotte looked up at him, vulnerability evident in her eyes. "I was so angry with you, Jackson, for months. But when I saw your face in that courtroom when you first saw them," she trailed off, shaking her head, "I never stopped loving you. That's what made it all so painful." The confession hung in the air between them, a bridge across the chasm they'd created. Before Jackson could respond, the door opened, and Dr. Patterson, the specialist, entered with a tablet in hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Reed," she began, and neither corrected the assumption of their marital status. "We have Abigail's results." Jackson took Charlotte's free hand, their fingers intertwining instinctively as they braced for whatever news was coming. "The initial concern about PKU was unfounded," Dr. Patterson continued with a reassuring smile. "However, we did find something interesting in her genetic profile." "Interesting?" Charlotte repeated tensely. The doctor nodded. "Nothing concerning for her health, I assure you. But there is a genetic marker that's quite distinctive and unusual. Have either of you done genetic testing before?" Jackson and Charlotte exchanged confused looks, before both shaking their heads. "Well, I'd recommend it," Dr. Patterson said, "because Abigail's genetic profile shows some unique markers that are typically found in certain geographical populations, specifically Eastern European and Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry." Charlotte frowned. "But neither of us has that background. My family is mostly English and Scottish." "And Jackson's is Irish and Welsh predominantly," Jackson finished. Dr. Patterson looked between them, her expression carefully neutral. "Genetic heritage can sometimes contain surprises. Perhaps there's ancestry further back that you're unaware of." She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. "There is, of course, another possibility." The implication hung heavy in the room. Jackson felt Charlotte's hand tighten around his. "That's impossible," Charlotte said firmly. "There's no chance Abigail isn't Jackson's daughter." The specialist nodded professionally. "I understand this is sensitive, but from a medical perspective, it would be helpful to clarify the genetic lineage, especially for future health considerations. We can do a simple paternity test if you wish." Jackson's mind raced, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Charlotte's desperate attempts to reach him during her pregnancy, the prenup that would have left her with almost nothing if he could prove infidelity. Her reluctance to accept his financial help initially. "I'll take the test," Jackson said, his voice strangely calm despite the storm raging inside him. After the doctor left to arrange the testing, an awful silence filled the room. Charlotte stood with her back to him, Abigail sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, unaware of the earthquake shaking her parents' world. "Jackson," Charlotte began, turning to face him. "Did you know," he asked quietly, "when you came to the courthouse, did you know there was a chance they weren't mine?" Charlotte's face crumpled. "They're yours in every way that matters." It wasn't a direct answer, and they both knew it. The room seemed to shrink around them, the tentative bridge they'd been building suddenly engulfed in flames. "Who?" Jackson asked, a question he both needed and dreaded to have answered. Charlotte's silence spoke volumes. "Was it during our marriage or after I moved out?" he pressed, his businessman's mind still seeking facts, data points to process the unprocessable. "After you left," Charlotte finally whispered. "You'd been gone for weeks. You wouldn't return my calls. I thought our marriage was over." "Who?" Jackson repeated, the single word carrying the weight of betrayal. Charlotte met his gaze, tears streaming down her face. "David Miller." The name hit Jackson like a physical blow. Not some stranger. Not a random encounter. David Miller, his former business partner, the man who had helped him build Horizon in the early days before Jackson bought him out, in a move that industry insiders had labeled cutthroat. Everything suddenly made terrible sense. the distinctive features he'd attributed to his own genetics, the timing of Charlotte's pregnancy. The reason his former partner had reached out repeatedly in the months before, attempts at contact Jackson had ignored, assuming David wanted to discuss business. "I need some air," Jackson said, moving toward the door. "Jackson, please," Charlotte called after him. "They're still yours. Nothing changes that." But something fundamental had changed, and they both knew it. As Jackson stepped into the hospital corridor, the empire builder who had once prided himself on controlling every variable in his life faced a truth he couldn't negotiate, buy, or power his way through. Jackson stood on the hospital roof, the Boston skyline stretching before him in the late afternoon sun. From this vantage point, he could see the gleaming tower that housed Horizon Technologies, the empire he had built from nothing, the achievement that had consumed his every waking hour for years. It seemed both imposingly close and impossibly distant now, like a life that belonged to someone else. The door to the roof access opened, and Jackson turned to see Martin Keller approaching, responding to the text Jackson had sent an hour before. "I came as soon as I could," his attorney said, concern evident in his normally composed features. "What's the emergency? Is it the Berlin deal?" Jackson almost laughed at the question, at how irrelevant the Berlin acquisition now seemed compared to the seismic shift in his personal life. "I need you to prepare paternity tests," Jackson said without preamble, "and I need to know my options regarding the divorce." Martin's eyebrows rose in surprise. "The twins aren't yours." "I don't know yet," Jackson replied honestly, "but I need to be prepared for all possibilities." As Martin outlined the legal ramifications, how the prenup would be enforced if infidelity could be proven, how custody would likely be determined, how Charlotte could be left with virtually nothing while Jackson walked away with his fortune intact, the billionaire found himself staring at the city below, seeing not buildings and streets, but the tiny faces of Ethan and Abigail. Abigail, who might not share his DNA, but whose smile had already claimed territory in his heart that no business success had ever reached. Ethan, who might be David Miller's biological son, but who had fallen asleep on Jackson's chest just last night. Tiny fingers curled around Jackson's thumb with complete trust. "Stop!" Jackson said suddenly, cutting Martin off mid-sentence. "Excuse me?" "Just stop," Jackson repeated, turning to face his attorney. "None of this matters." Martin looked baffled. "Of course it matters. We're talking about billions in assets, Jackson, your company, your legacy." "My legacy," Jackson echoed, the words tasting strange on his tongue. "What kind of legacy is built on taking everything from the mother of children I've come to love, regardless of biology?" "This is business, not emotion," Martin insisted. "Charlotte betrayed you with your former partner. The prenup exists precisely for situations like this." "No," Jackson corrected him. "The prenup exists because I didn't trust anyone enough to share what I built, because I valued things over people." He shook his head, sudden clarity washing over him. "That ends today." When Jackson returned to Abigail's hospital room, Charlotte was sitting in a chair by the window, their daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red from crying, her expression guarded. "The doctors say we can take her home," Charlotte said quietly. All her other tests came back normal. Jackson nodded, taking the seat across from her. For a long moment neither spoke, the weight of revelations and decisions hanging between them. "I called off the paternity test," Jackson finally said. Charlotte's eyes widened in surprise. "What? Why?" "Because it doesn't matter," Jackson replied simply. "DNA doesn't make a father. Being there does. Loving them does." Tears filled Charlotte's eyes. "Jackson, I never meant to hurt you. After you left, I was so lost, so alone. David reached out, offering support as a friend at first. One night, after too many glasses of wine and months of feeling abandoned—" "I don't need the details," Jackson interrupted gently. "I understand more than you might think. I abandoned our marriage long before I physically moved out. I put Horizon before everything, before you, before us, before the family we could have built together." Charlotte studied his face, searching for anger or resentment, but finding none. "What happens now?" Jackson took a deep breath. "That depends on what you want, Charlotte, because I know what I want." "And what's that?" "I want to be Ethan and Abigail's father. I want to be there for every milestone, every skinned knee, every triumph and challenge. I want to be the man they deserve in their lives." He paused, reaching across to take her hand. "And I want another chance with you. Not because of obligation or guilt, but because these weeks with you and the twins have shown me what truly matters." Charlotte's expression was a mixture of hope and hesitation. "And Horizon?" Your empire? The man who cancelled our 5th anniversary dinner to fly to Tokyo for an emergency board meeting. I've already called Diane, Jackson said. I'm stepping down as CEO. I'll remain on the board, but the day-to-day operations will be her responsibility moving forward. You're giving up your company? Charlotte asked incredulously. But it's your life's work. Jackson shook his head, looking at Abigail's peaceful face. No, our family, this is my life's work. I just didn't realize it until I almost lost it. 2 weeks later, Jackson stood in the kitchen of Charlotte's brownstone, their brownstone now, preparing bottles while Charlotte showered, a rare luxury with 14-week-old twins. The transition hadn't been seamless. There were still moments of tension, lingering trust issues to work through, a marriage to rebuild from its foundation. But each day brought them closer, more certain of the path they had chosen. The doorbell rang, and Jackson frowned, not expecting visitors. With practiced ease, he adjusted Abigail in one arm while carrying Ethan in the other, a feat that would have seemed impossible a month ago. When he opened the door, David Miller stood on the doorstep, looking as surprised to see Jackson as Jackson was to see him. Jackson, David said, his voice tight with tension. You thought I'd be at the office, Jackson finished for him. A reasonable assumption given my track record. An uncomfortable silence stretched between the former business partners and current rivals for fatherhood. David's eyes moved to the twins in Jackson's arms, lingering on Ethan with an intensity that confirmed what Jackson already knew in his heart. Charlotte told me about the hospital, David said finally, about the genetic markers. Jackson nodded, studying the man before him. There had been a time when he and David had been more than business partners. They had been friends, confidants, sharing late nights and big dreams as they built Horizon from nothing, before ambition and ego had driven them apart. Would you like to come in? Jackson asked, surprising himself with the invitation. David hesitated before stepping inside, his discomfort evident as he followed Jackson to the living room. Jackson carefully placed the twins in their swings before turning to face his former partner. I assume you're here to assert your rights, Jackson said directly. David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration Jackson remembered well from their startup days. I don't know why I'm here, honestly. When Charlotte told me you knew, that you'd moved in with her and the twins, I expected lawyers, not an invitation into your home. Our home, Jackson corrected. And there are children now, regardless of biology. David's expression hardened. You can't just decide that. If Ethan is mine, then he has 2 fathers who care about him, Jackson interrupted. One who's been there since birth, changing diapers, walking the floors at night, learning every expression and cry, and one who helped create him. The bluntness of the statement hung in the air between them. Finally, David sank onto the couch, the fight seeming to drain out of him. I never expected this situation, he admitted. After you pushed me out of Horizon, after everything fell apart between us. Charlotte was just someone who understood, someone who had also been cast aside when you decided we weren't useful to your ambitions anymore. The accusation stung, but Jackson couldn't deny its truth. I made choices I regret, he acknowledged, treating people as assets or obstacles rather than human beings with feelings and needs of their own. Before David could respond, Charlotte appeared in the doorway, freezing when she saw the 2 men together. David, she said, her voice barely audible, what are you doing here? He came to meet Ethan, Jackson answered for him, surprising both Charlotte and David with his calm acceptance, and I think that's right. The children deserve to know everyone who loves them. Charlotte moved to Jackson's side, her hand finding his in a gesture of unity that spoke volumes. What exactly are you suggesting? Jackson looked between Charlotte and David, then at the twins, contentedly swinging nearby. I'm suggesting we find a way forward that puts their needs first, that acknowledges complicated truths without letting ego or pride get in the way. In that moment, Jackson Reed, the man once known as the most ruthless CEO in America, chose a path that no business school had ever taught him. Compassion over victory, family over empire, love over pride. 6 months later, on a warm summer evening, Jackson sat on a blanket in the public garden watching Charlotte chase a giggling Ethan across the grass, while David pushed Abigail on a toddler swing nearby. The arrangement they had forged wasn't conventional. David was a presence in the twins' lives, a special uncle figure for now, with the truth to be shared when they were old enough to understand. Charlotte returned to the blanket, breathless from play, and collapsed beside Jackson. Worth it? She asked, the question encompassing everything. His career change, their reconciliation, the unconventional family they had created. Jackson looked at his wife, at the twins. at the life he had nearly sacrificed for quarterly earnings reports and market dominance. He thought of his new role heading Horizon's charitable foundation, working 3 days a week while spending the rest with his family. He remembered the man who had walked into that courthouse, determined to end his marriage and walk away unchanged. "Beyond measure," he replied, pulling Charlotte close as the Boston sunset painted their unconventional family in hues of gold.